And most of the time on questions you want. And at the very end, we're going to take 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll take pictures of anybody who wants a picture, because I noticed several of you kept jumping up and getting pictures. So, and those of you who were trapped over here couldn't do it very easily. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm very interested in sharing ideas. The reason I agreed to come is I think that developing the next generation of conservative activists and conservative leaders is very, very important. I just got a note the other day from the Young Americas Foundation. I think I've spoken at 19 of their last 20 annual meetings. And I do that because I really do think education matters. I do think getting people committed matters. So I'm going to give you sort of 3 or 4 big jumps. Think of this as an outline, not a talk. First of all, my younger daughter, Jackie Cushman, and I wrote a book called 5 Principles for a Successful Life. It's really aimed at people who are younger than you, but the principles are universal. So I just want to share them with you, because these are things I actually developed out of trying to think about, what had I done in my life that was successful. 5 easy ideas. The first is to dream big. The second is to work hard. The third is to learn every day. The fourth is to enjoy life. And the fifth is to be true to yourself. And let me just tell you why I say this. You're at the right age to dream big. If you don't have the courage to dream big at your current age, you won't acquire it at 45. And dreaming big can be anything. I mean, it can be having a family. It can be, I have a 12-year-old granddaughter who wants to be a ballerina. I have a 10-year-old grandson who will be 11 on Saturday who thinks he wants to either be a chess player or a sniper. He's not sure which yet. He has a range, but at 9 years of age, he read SEAL Team 6, so he's deeply into this stuff. And I just encourage people to think about who do you want to be and have the courage to not be who your teacher tells you or your parents or your friends, but try to feel inside yourself. Second, understand, and this is where I disagree so deeply with President Obama, the key to success is to work hard. I mean, his comments the other day verged on irrational or just a left-wing academic. One of the problems of having tenured faculty is that they are all grateful somebody pays them. None of them actually create the money, but they're happy that alumni show up or you show up or the federal government shows up to pay them. This gives them a slightly distorted vision of how the world works. People who are successful all work hard. And this is a primary thing to get locked in your head. If you want to play a big game, you're going to have to practice. In order to practice, you've got to put in the time, which gets me to my third point, which is enjoy life. I learned many years ago, I did a course, and as part of the course, we had one of the most famous inventors of restaurants in America, Norman Brinker. And Brinker had invented TGI Fridays, he'd invented steak and ale, he invented the salad bar, he invented the waiter walking up and introducing themselves. I mean, he had, at one point, there were 7 million people who worked for various chains he had helped found. And we interviewed him, and he said, when people come to ask him for career advice, well, no matter what their age, his number one question is, what do you like doing? And the reason is, to do anything really well, you have to do it so much that you have got to like it. Nobody can will themselves to do something consistently that they don't like. And so I really encourage you to think about it. And like doesn't mean that it's always ha-ha fun, but it means you have some deep sense of satisfaction that this is a good way to spend your day. I spend virtually all of my time is spent either learning or teaching. I teach in speeches, I teach in books. I just wrote an e-book called No Taxation by Misrepresentation, which was taking on the Obamacare tax fight. And we did it in part as an experiment to see how e-books work and to see, we literally did it in 8 days. I just did a paper that we just submitted to Politico about an hour ago, arguing that it was legitimate to ask questions about national security in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so I'm constantly either reading, listening, writing, speaking, doing media, and that's probably 90% of what I do. And so obviously I'm half Irish. I like talking. I like writing. I like learning. So all this kind of works pretty well for me. You then, I think, have to recognize, you've got to learn every day. And the reason you have to learn every day is twofold. The first is the world's really big. I'm 69 years old. I have worked at politics since August of 1958. And I learn stuff every day. I've traveled a fair amount of the planet, and I'm looking forward to my next trip because there'll be things I've never seen before. I'm currently working on a novel and potentially a movie about George Washington as a young man, tentatively entitled Washington in the Wilderness. And I'm back re-engaging, rethinking about Washington, somebody who I first encountered probably when I was 9 or 10 years old. And I was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And I had a grandmother who taught me American history when I was very, very young. And yet now at 69, I have a whole new set of questions, a whole new set of understanding, and I'm back trying to learn again. So you got to say to yourself, if I'm going to achieve a big dream, I'm going to work hard, I'm going to learn every day, and I have to enjoy it. So if you find yourself trapped into something, you suddenly realize, I really don't enjoy this, you have to have the courage to change. And I think it's very important, which gets me to my last point, which is you have to be true to yourself. Because the fact is, if you're not true to yourself, you'll just crumble. You can't be true to somebody else. I mean, you can't say, they get to define for me whether or not I'm okay. You get actually Adam Smith in his first great book, Theory of Moral Sentiments, which precedes The Wealth of Nations, writes about the idea of looking in the mirror. When you look in the mirror, are you seeing a person you want to be? And if not, candidly, the person who has to change is you, not other people who validate you. And it's a very hard thing to do. I've done things in my career that absolutely involved people thinking that I was nuts. Some of the time, by the way, they were right. Which is one of the points I'd make about working hard. It doesn't always work. I just lost a presidential nomination. Some of you probably know this. I ran for Congress twice and lost in 74 and 76. I had a project starting in December of 78 to create a House Republican majority. We've been in the minority since 1954. So I figured 24 years was long enough. Well, the project I was running, we lost in 80, 82, 84, 86, 88, 90, and 92. And there were people who would have told you the weekend before the election or election day of 1994 that I was nuts. Because clearly we couldn't become majority. I actually saw a guy the other day who said to me that the two great surprises of his life were that you actually could have a Republican Speaker of the House and that the Berlin Wall fell. And that he put them in kind of the same league. So I had to be willing to endure 2 lost congressional campaigns in order to finally win. I had to be willing to endure losing year after year, getting back up and saying, gee, what didn't quite work, and going back at it. And if we hadn't had that, I coined a phrase in that period called cheerful persistence. And both words are important. You have to, anything you really want to achieve, you have to persist. But if you want to be effective, you have to persist cheerfully. In a free society, you attract people by being cheerful. If you're persisting but you're grumpy, people hide from you. If you're depressed, they ignore you. If you're angry, they try not to get near you. But on the other hand, if you're cheerful, they will tolerate you. Just think about people you know personally. And cheerful persistence is a disciplined behavior. Now, a couple books I want to recommend to you. I would urge all of you to buy a copy of Peter Drucker's The Effective Executive. Drucker's argument is that in the information age, every worker is an executive. That knowledge workers, by definition, are about executing. It's about 168 pages long. It is an astonishing book. I urge you to buy it in paperback because it is, I think, the best single book on being effective I've ever seen. And he starts with a very important point, which I believe deeply, having spent my whole lifetime studying it. Effectiveness is a learned habit. It's not about genetics. It's not about IQ. It's not about personality. It's about learning a set of patterns that work and then being disciplined about reapplying them and reapplying them and reapplying them and learning in the process. And so I really strongly urge you to read Drucker's Effective Executive. Let me talk briefly about where we are as a conservative movement. I think we are in the middle of a tremendous amount of change, and I don't frankly know quite how we're going to get from where we are to where we're going. The conservative movement really began in its modern form in reaction against the Republican establishment and against the national establishment, which are parallel but not identical. So if you go back and you look at the rise of Goldwater, it's really taking on both the national system, the welfare state, Lyndon Johnson, et cetera, and it's taking on the Republican establishment, Nelson Rockefeller, the Northeast, et cetera. And it had a huge impact. There's no question that it changed the underlying pattern of the Republican Party decisively in ways that are still true to this day. At the same time, it created the framework within which Reagan could rise. But it's important to remember, if you go back, and this is why I'm a historian and not a political scientist. Any social science which has straight lines is inherently unlike the real world. I just offer you that when you go back to school. Because the real world doesn't have straight lines. In 1972, when Richard Nixon won a decisive re-election and carried virtually every state in the country against George McGovern, there was zero reason to believe Ronald Reagan would become president. The vice president was Spiro Agnew. He was a conservative. There was every reason to believe that at the end of 4 years, Nixon's 8 years, that Agnew would be the Republican nominee. I suspect Reagan thought Agnew would become the Republican nominee. There's a great book on I think it's called A Heartbeat Away, about the discovery that Agnew was a crook and getting him out of the vice presidency, which led Nixon to then pick Gerald Ford. Nixon then resigns. Ford becomes president. Ford then makes two huge mistakes. He treats Reagan with contempt, which just makes Reagan irritated, and he picks Nelson Rockefeller to be the vice presidential nominee. Had Ford picked Reagan to be the vice presidential nominee, history would have been totally different. Reagan probably would not have ended up running for president. He would have been on a ticket with Ford that either would have won or lost. If it had won, Ford would then have served as president. And I'm just suggesting you go through this stuff. If you look as the guy who tells this story really beautifully is one of the leading analysts of American polling, he always says that he learned about campaigns being real because he was convinced to leave his job and go to work for Teddy Kennedy when Kennedy was like 30 points ahead. And the week after he left to go to work for Kennedy, Kennedy gave an interview with Roger Mudd for 60 Minutes in which Roger Mudd asked a trick question. This is 1979. Kennedy is running against Jimmy Carter. And Roger Mudd asked this very unfair trick question. He said, "Why do you want to be president?" And Kennedy couldn't answer him. And he couldn't answer him so badly. If you can probably Google this, I suspect it's available, that his campaign just started to collapse. And Charlie Cook is the guy who tells the story. And Charlie Cook is the one who had left his job in order to be a field organizer for Kennedy because this was going to be the winning campaign. And he watched it disintegrate. But there was no point in '79 where you would have said, Reagan's inevitable. At this stage in 1980, Reagan was 9 points behind Carter. So you wouldn't have said right now Reagan was inevitable. I'm just giving this as a way of thinking. You don't know how the movement's going to evolve in the next phase. You don't know what's going to happen decisively. But let me tell you what I think the three great needs are. First, we have to win the cultural fight to take back the campuses. We have allowed the left to develop a bizarre domination of American intellectual life, much of it reinforced by coercive behavior. And it's going to be a real brawl. I mean, how many of you are on a campus where it is decisively painful to be conservative? Okay. Well, why should that be true? I mean, conservatism is the dominant value structure of the vast majority of the American people. Why should we tolerate academics who are nuts, imposing, I mean, literally in some cases just nuts, imposing their view, imposing false history. I mean, teaching stuff that's not true. I mean, you want to understand why Barack Obama has such whacked out ideas? He is a perfect representative of the academic class. He really believes this stuff. He thinks work doesn't matter. He thinks you can't get there on your own. He thinks government's this magic thing that should work. I mean, I think he was genuinely shocked to discover that shovel-ready jobs weren't shovel-ready. Now, I mean, to live in America and not figure out that our bureaucracies are not exactly agile is truly being out of touch with reality. But I think he lives in that world of people who get together and have nice cocktail parties and tell each other about the latest weird book they read. And get all excited because some highly esoteric poet is coming by who was last read by 11 people, but who hates America and has this wonderful new poem called Why I Hate America, which is filled with deeply powerful meaning. Am I describing a world some of you know? I mean, is this okay? So I think that part of this, one of the great challenges of the conservative movement in the next generation is a head-on, all-out fight in the academic world. And those of you who are attracted by that, I would urge you, get your PhD, go find a campus, start a war. You know, and you don't have to argue for countervailing bias, you just have to argue for facts. I mean, a fact-based society destroys modern liberalism, because modern liberalism is based on such a large number of fantasies and highly inaccurate things. Second, we desperately need a generation of innovation. I mean, one of the sad parts about my not having been more competent as a candidate is that we really need a whole range of new ideas. I'll just give you 2 or 3 quick examples. Brain research, Alzheimer's, autism, Parkinson's, mental health, traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorders. Brain research is the biggest area of breakthrough in the next 25 years. It will have more impact on human lives. It will have more impact on the federal budget. It is the, you know, we have all of this effort on AIDS, and I understand the importance of AIDS, and I understand also the political power of AIDS. But the fact is, Alzheimer's is massively bigger. Autism is massively bigger. Why is it we don't have the same level of focus and investment, and why aren't we having the kind of breakthroughs we ought to be having in brain research, which covers all these aspects? Second, well, we got into a brawl about it. I meant what I said about going into space. And the weakness we got into was that my opponents promptly said, well, NASA is so incompetent, how could you possibly throw that much money at it? That was the right question. But they then, of course, cut off the answer. What we need is a new model of going into space that uses the private sector. It uses prizes. It uses entrepreneurship. My guess is, I've been told by people who are pretty knowledgeable about this, people who've had 30 years of experience in space, they believe a private sector effort to get to the moon would cost about 5% of what the federal government plans to spend. And the model I always tell people is the Wright brothers. The Wright brothers practiced for 5 years, spend a total of $500. This was 1900 money, so it'd be a lot more today. But spent $500. They actually had 500 flights that failed. On December 17th, 1903, the first 4 flights failed. They flew on the 5th flight. And so they discovered how to fly for $500. The Smithsonian got a $50,000 grant from the U.S. Congress, built a very elaborate, very fancy airplane, launched it off of a boat on the Potomac, and it went into the water and sank. So you have a $500 private sector, 2 guys who are passionate, and a $50,000 bureaucratic project. And the Smithsonian was so mad at the Wright brothers for succeeding that the relations were so bad that for 37 years the Wright brothers would not give them the Wright Flyer. If you go down to the Air and Space Museum, you can see the Wright Flyer, the original plane. But it took 35 years to get it because the relations were so bad. So we need some of you, those of you who are interested in doing this, we need a generation of innovation. We need to apply something like Lean Six Sigma to replace the civil service model of government. It would save trillions of dollars. We need to fundamentally overhaul the Congressional Budget Office, which is a disaster. The Congressional Budget Office is a bastion of reactionary liberalism propping up models that don't work. And we don't have the intellectual horsepower engaged in these kind of fights. The third thing we need is something we have a fair amount of, but we still need probably 10 times as much. We just need a lot more noisy people. You know, we need people who are prepared. There's so many fronts to have fights on right now. And of course, some of it's cultural, some of it is dealing with a changing real world, and some of it is dealing with the Obama administration. But we need more people on blogs, more people on Twitter, more people on talk radio, more people on TV, more people writing books. It's a key part. Two last examples. We're now going through a revolution in energy. There's an American energy opportunity that by itself is going to remake your life. I mean, you should be dramatically optimistic, especially if we can beat Obama this fall. We will see a takeoff in the next decade that will once again make America the leading country in the world. We'll be the dominant manufacturing country by the end of the decade. We'll be the dominant provider of energy. People forget, I mean, we are an enormously endowed country. When I first taught environmental studies in the early 1970s, this would be a great case study for one of you who wants to go do a very interesting book someday. We used a very popular book at that time called The Limits to Growth. And The Limits to Growth had been developed by the Club of Rome using fancy computer models at MIT, and it was seen as very advanced because it had all this computer stuff. It was one of the first proofs that garbage in, garbage out is a very important part of computer work. Everything they described was wrong. I mean, this is the problem of modern left-wing environmentalism. Every single prediction, if you get a copy of The Limits to Growth, it's just wrong. Now, the most recent vivid example of the left being wrong is a concept called peak energy. How many of you have ever heard of peak energy? The idea that, or peak oil, the idea we're going to run up. Raise your hand if you know, it's one of the things that academic leftists love talking about peak oil. That we're going to run out. It's all going to be terrible. There's actually a very funny movie. I think it's called The Last Car, made in 1980, I think, and it's like Jimmy Carter's world come true. There's only enough gasoline left for one car. The whole rest of the country no longer has cars. I mean, it's just it is a sort of a black utopia, if you will, in which everything the left dreams of has kind of happened, and it's really miserable. In that context, innovation has changed everything. We now have a combination of what's called fracking and horizontal drilling, which enables you to go down and get what's called tight oil or get gas in shale. Historically, we knew that there was gas and oil at depth in certain kinds of formations, but we didn't know how to get them. So when you say, how much reserves do you have, that was zero. Well, let me just give you two numbers that illustrate the scale of the American energy opportunity. The amount of natural gas that is recoverable in the United States went from 7 years in 2000 to 125 years today. So for all practical purposes, you know, for most of you, a few of you may live more than 125 years, but for most of you, we've already found enough natural gas to get through your lifetime. And remember, this is assuming we don't find more. And let me give you the numbers in oil. 10 years ago, North Dakota had 150 million barrels of recoverable reserves. The current number is 24 billion. North Dakota this year passed California and Alaska. It is now the second largest oil producing state in the United States. Now, this is what's wrong with liberalism. If you'd gone out 10 years ago and said, North Dakota is going to be the #2 oil producing state, they said that's crazy because they live in a Polaroid snapshot world. But history is made dynamically. History is made by inventing new things, creating new potential. How many of you have a phone that has a video camera? Yeah, I rest my case. I mean, just think about the dynamics of what's happening to your personal capacity to deal with the internet. So there are things we can do, and we need a generation of innovation, and then we need people willing to be noisy about why we should get it. And we need to reset the country on a belief that we can have a dramatically better future. And I think that's the challenge for your generation. Let me, if it's okay, I'm going to toss it open for questions. And I gather you should ask the questions into the microphone so the nice C-SPAN people will know what's going on.